This is Samsung, and in this video we are looking at the Prague Spring. So first of all, let's look at the crisis in Czechoslovakia. As since 1948, Czechoslovakia had been under communist control. And for the Soviets, Czechoslovakia had always been a loyal satellite state, and they would generally support the party officials. But the first signs of the easing of change came in 1963. And in May 1963, the Czechoslovak Communist Party reluctantly sanctioned a writers' conference devoted to the Prague writer Franz Kafka, and he had previously been seen as too bourgeois. Now, the failing economy in the 1960s also led to a slight governmental reforms, and these reforms empowered local managers and gave priority to goods wanted by customers. However, there were still major signals of revolt within the 1960s, and within these revolts, the influential Czechoslovak economist Professor Otar Sík proposed many other reforms to improve the economy. Now, these included a communist party that would be responsive to public opinion, the existence of consumer rights, the workforce having more power and being able to replace the managers, and an end to centrally planned economic targets for the whole country. As the Communist Party were not going to allow these changes to take place, in 1966, Sík argued for political reform. And this movement gained support from intellectuals and students at first, before reaching the wider public soon after that. And this appetite for change led to an acknowledgement by the Soviet Union that changes of leadership were required in Czechoslovakia. So by the end of 1967, the leader of the Communist Party, President Antonin Novotny, was being blamed for his failure in half-hearted reforms which failed to prevent the economic decline, and he was facing criticism from those within his own party. So this meant that Novotny invited the Soviet leader Leonid Brezhnev to visit Prague. Now, upon seeing the extent of the dissatisfaction within the Communist Party and Czechoslovakia, Brezhnev orchestrated the resignation of Novotny, and he was replaced with Alexander Dubček. Now, Dubček was a typical party bureaucrat and a Slovak, and this meant that the Soviets hoped that he could prevent protest. However, Dubček was also a major advocate of political reform, and he said that there had to be a new start to socialism, and this became known as socialism with a human face. Now, Dubček quickly started to replace key officials without consulting the Kremlin, but this started to further escalate, and this is what's known as the Prague Spring. And in April 1968, Dubček announced the Action Programme, and this called for the easing of censorship, a curb on the powers of the secret police, a 10-year transition into free elections, a better relationship with Western powers, formal recognition of the State of Israel, more independence for enterprises, and increased autonomy for the repressed Slovak minority. For many hardline communists within Eastern Europe, such as Erich Honecker in East Germany and János Kadar in Hungary, the relaxation of press censorship in Czechoslovakia put the whole of Eastern Europe at risk of democratic infection. Now, Dubček's reform were not anti-communist because the Communist Party would continue to hold its leading role in the country. Instead, the Communist Party would acknowledge the legitimacy of things like trade unions and new associations like Club K231, and this was made up of former political prisoners. But between April and August, the appetite for change gathered momentum, all press censorship was ended, plans were brought up to open borders with the West, and they began to trade agreements with West Germany. Now, throughout this time, the anti-Soviet voices were becoming louder. But as these reforms were taking place, Dubček assured Moscow that Czechoslovakia would remain a loyal member of the Warsaw Pact and that they only wanted to implement reforms within the existing communist framework. But on the 14th to the 15th of July, the leaders of the USSR, Bulgaria, East Germany, Hungary and Poland held a meeting where they expressed their concerns over the reforms in Czechoslovakia. And the subsequent Warsaw Letter, which was from the Warsaw Pact to Czechoslovak officials, argued that challenges to socialism within one country would not be tolerated as it was a threat to the overall unity of socialism. So at the end of July, Brezhnev and Dubček had the last of 6 meetings, and the Soviets were hoping to cause a split in the government in which a pro-Soviet faction would emerge, but this did not happen. So instead, Brezhnev attempted to coerce Dubček into reversing his reforms. And although Dubček did promise to do so, he continued upon his liberalising path. So this meant, much to the surprise of Dubček, the Warsaw Pact forces invaded on the 20th to the 21st of August 1968. And this invasion consisted of 250,000 soldiers, which later rose to 500,000, and 2,000 tanks. And they were troops coming from the USSR, Poland, Hungary and Bulgaria. But Romania's Ceausescu refused to participate as he had sided with Dubček, and in Albania, Enver Hoxha both refused to participate, and he later withdrew from the Warsaw Pact in 1968. Now, Albania's withdrawal from the Warsaw Pact was a long time coming though, because Hoxha was a Maoist, and as Albania were fairly insignificant towards the USSR in terms of their economy and military, Brezhnev did not intervene. But despite the fact that the USSR had breached the sovereignty of Czechoslovakia, they did face no international action, and the only real opposition came within the communist camp in both China and Romania. The US were reluctant to intervene because they were both distracted by the growing anti-war movement in Vietnam, and they were also keen to pursue an arms control treaty with Moscow. But in Czechoslovakia, 300,000 people fled the country, while the others were forced to resign themselves under an oppressive government. And in January 1969, a student named Jan Palach set himself in fire in the centre of Prague, and he died a few days later, and his funeral became a major demonstration against the occupation. But this shows that the Soviet Union was still not going to allow major reforms, and there was no significant reforms until right at the end of the Cold War, and we'll look at that way later on. So thank you for watching this video, and see you soon. Bye.